Hey, I'm Francesca Maxime, and this is WiseGirl for Valentine's Day 2018. And I have a very special guest for you today with our chat with Lama Rod Owens. Lama Rod, just wave and say hi. So great to connect with him. He's a formally trained Buddhist teacher, identifies as a Black queer male, born and raised in the South, heavily influenced by church and community, and also the author of this book, which I read last year, I believe, Radical Dharma, co-authored with a couple of really amazing people, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams and Jasmine Siadula, who you guys teach together, I know, a lot. So I highly recommend this book, and we're going to talk about it and a bunch of good stuff today. So Lama Rod, thanks so much for being here on WiseGirl.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really my pleasure. I wanted to start by where we are, which is often a place that sometimes people are so much in their head, we forget about talking about where we really are and where our bodies really are. And maybe just coming into presence with the fact that it's Valentine's Day, which although it may be a constructed holiday, if you will, in many respects, may also be an opportunity to discuss love and what love really means. And perhaps I would invite you to talk about the difference between what we think of as love and what I've kind of come to understand as unconditional love versus attachment.
Yeah. And for me, it's the difference between conditional loving and unconditional loving. And when I was growing up, like I never had a clear definition of love. I was so influenced by the culture around me. I was influenced by art. Most strongly, I was influenced by music, love songs, R&B songs, which, that understanding of love for me was more like suffering, And so, but that's what I knew about love. And so coming into meditation practice, coming to Buddhism, one of the first things I got was a very clear definition of love, which was the wish for others to be happy, but it's also the wish for ourselves to be happy. And that was so liberating for me. For the first time in my life, it was just so clear, and that love was different than liking. And I always thought that love and like were the same thing. But like is so conditional, it's so subjective, and one of the first direct teachings my root Lama gave to me, Lama Nola Rinpoche offered me, was, one day we were just sitting down and he was like, listen, I don't like everyone, and this is like this realized meditation teacher, this realized master, but he was like, I love everyone. And that's what our work is to love everyone, to want people to be happy, not to like anyone. He was like, if I love you and if I like you, I keep you around. If I don't like you, then I don't hang around you, nor do you hang around me, And that cleared it up for me completely, And then I was able to go back to look through my life and say, okay, what are the experiences of being unconditionally loved? And I began to reflect on those experiences. Then I was like, okay, what were the, situations where I was receiving conditional loving, and that's where a lot of the pain was for me. It's a lot of the woundedness for me. I think that's the case for so many of us, that, we associate love with having to perform in certain ways to receive that love, and often it's about fulfilling other people's needs, making other people comfortable. And that's the only way we understand love, is by fulfilling other people's needs and expectations of us. So when I started really switching over to like this like wish for people to be happy, this wish for myself to be happy, and that kind of like completely began to disrupt a lot of my relationships. And that was the beginning of radical love, and this is something I'm still working with. I'm not an expert, I know how to talk about love, but every single day I'm struggling to understand how to be happy and how to work for the happiness of others.
And working for the happiness of yourself is a way to work toward the happiness of others, wouldn't you say? And wouldn't you say that part of meditation in general, insight meditation, Buddhist meditation, by turning the lens inside and inward, we're taking time to become intimate with ourselves in a way that opens us up to being intimate and vulnerable with others?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I often have to clarify is my understanding of happiness. So when I say happiness, I'm not necessarily talking about this euphoric kind of emotional state. But when I talk about happiness, I'm talking about this deeper kind of happiness that's about contentment. That's about connection, that's about vulnerability and openness. And that kind of happiness can always be present despite what we're experiencing, despite the pain, despite the suffering. So we can experience happiness as we move through really difficult situations, really difficult mental experiences. But yes, first and foremost, like, we have to have an understanding of happiness for ourselves. We have to do the work for ourselves. You can't go out and do the work for other people if you've not done that work for yourself, because you don't know what that is for other people. Do you know what is for you?
Well, that's what gets to my next point, which is, in our culture, especially, we are pretty much raised to believe that you have to think that there's something wrong with you, because otherwise there would be no one to market to. Who would buy all this crap in magazines and on TV ads and all this kind of stuff? And so finding and nitpicking away at who or what you are and just seeing the deficit and the lack, as opposed to the wholeness and the goodness, seems to be part and parcel with this Western culture that we're living in. And instead of disidentifying with it and just saying, oh, that's just marketing, we kind of soak it in, because there's also usually some of that stuff, as you said earlier, in our personal, more, family or community oriented experiences as well, where we have to perform for others to make other people happy and try to save them, which is actually a beautiful quality that children just shouldn't necessarily have to be tasked with, right? So how do you then do that, and how is that complicated with issues in terms of, I guess, supremacy and subjugation and all of the things that come along, especially with issues pertaining to race and gender in Western culture, for starters, because we don't have to take on the whole world, although it exists in many permutations.
Yeah, one of the things that we have to realize is that systems are always giving us something to live up to. I call it the ideal. Like, we have this ideal that's thrown at us, and we're told that if we don't meet that ideal, then we're actually, there's something wrong with us. Within the capitalist model, then, like, that kind of striving for the ideal is how we keep producing and also keep consuming. So that ideal is like the carrot being held out in front of you. You can never quite get it, but as you strive for it, you're like consuming and you're like producing, efforts, and you're producing like all these other things that you think you need in order to get that carrot. And what we have to do, particularly with practices of self-love, is to actually come back to the self, practice kindness for ourselves and patience for ourselves. And that begins to help us to understand that we actually have everything that we need inherently in our experience. And then that begins to disrupt our kind of buying into these systems and these productions.
So that's part of the radical part of Radical Dharma. Some people, I think, look at that and they just can't get over the fact that that they are worthy, right? Whatever that worthiness word means. And there's that whole idea of clinging to suffering, clinging to an identity, clinging to that this is the way that it is. I have to be this way because it's the way it's always been. But you keep using the word disruption, and it is precisely that. We're sort of upending that narrative when you look at it with a more Buddhist lens or a mindful lens or an insight lens, to say, well, in fact, you can change the narrative. But the striving part seems to be the part that is perhaps most seductive, which is the part that, as I understand it anyway, is the root of sort of that clinging and grasping. So which, is the root of really what causes a lot of suffering and pain for so many people. So can you talk about how one makes the shift away from that striving and that hardened belief that, well, if I'm not striving, then I can't just be being. It would be so wrong to just be in love with myself, even though that might feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's about disrupting this kind of capitalist mindset that says, like, I have to be doing something to be valid. To be in the world, I have to do something. To take up space, I have to justify my existence. And I think particularly for marginalized groups, and I'll just speak from my experience as being, Black identified, it's like so much of my life was me being conditioned to prove and to justify that I should be in the world and I should take up space, and that, being also a descendant of slaves, one of the things that I've been really trying to work with and contemplate is that, I am not fulfilling the original purpose that my ancestors, were fulfilling, and which is why they were brought into this context, was to fulfill a purpose. And I'm not doing that now. And so I have to actually reimagine a different way of being in the world and exemplify that for those around me. So I started doing the early roots of that as I was transitioning into my meditation practice, but you have to go through this process, just like I did, where you start disconnecting from all of these messages, all of these voices. You start walking away from certain relationships. You start isolating yourself because you have to start listening to your own basic experience. You do that through retreat. You do that through silence. You do that through self-reflection. You begin to listen to who and what you are. Then you begin to trust that. You begin to have an experience of that. And then it's that experience that you begin to move with into the world. And you say, okay, these are the voices, these are the forces, these are the influences. I see that. And now I can turn back to my basic experience to see and to know what I'm really all about. And that's what I privilege, is my own basic needs, appetite, and simple being, in the world. And then I put that into dialogue with everything else around me.
And that's so rich, because I think that from that place, then that dialogue comes from a place of centeredness and a place of mutual respect and open-mindedness, which when you're fighting with yourself internally, it's hard to kind of come from that place. It's easier to be pulled off your rocker, which kind of leads me to my next line of questioning, which is around the idea of the fact that I told you that I'm sort of multi-ethnic. I'm Haitian and Dominican on one side, and I'm Italian American on the other in terms of identity, right? Of course, we can just say there's no self and all of these other things. But and I've had the privilege of sitting with POC groups, with people of color groups, and I've had the privilege of also being with implicit bias class groups, people who are self-identified as white and who are trying to extend the conversation into what it is that they're missing when it comes to understanding people of color or people who have a different skin, or racial or ethnic background than they do. So it's been an interesting space to kind of sit with both, and both are sort of a part of me. So I have understood and learned different things from different folks. One of the things that has come up a lot in the implicit bias classes with white folks that I've been around is, it touches a little on what you've talked about earlier, which is sort of a shame spiral, or what in some ways has been talked about as white fragility, or has been talked a little bit about, oh, it's all on me, or I didn't do that, or the overwhelm, and then the shutdown, and then the kind of push away, as opposed to that beautiful dialogue that you're inviting people to start to get into once they kind of can get to a place of self-stabilization, if you will, internally. And you started the conversation by talking about liberation of suffering for all, not just for one. So can you talk about what it is that you might like to see from folks who are white identified who want to sort of engage in this conversation that maybe, isn't what we talk about all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, when we're working with white folks, one of the things that we, at least from my experience, one of the things that I've had to kind of understand is that, like, a lot of white folks don't actually know how to struggle in the ways a lot of people of color have had to struggle in terms of understanding racialization and also understanding the trauma associated with racialization. You know, this language may not be something that we use in our communities, but we know the experiences of trauma and racialization. So white folks actually don't have that experience. Like, they have the experience of racialization, they have the experience of trauma, but they don't see that, because that's how power, privilege, and superiority and dominance actually disrupts that, that disrupts connecting to that. And so this whole idea of white fragility, I actually don't believe in, but what I actually do believe in is how, a lot of white folks don't know how to put in the kinds of effort that many people of color have had to put in order to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to encourage white identified folks to develop a kind of diligence and effort in doing this work, and that when you hit like difficult stuff, difficult material, difficult emotional states, then that's when you actually continue to work harder, you push through that. And that's when you use your Dharma practice. If you have a Dharma practice, if you have a meditation practice, you hold that space. You begin to experience what the guilt feels like, what the sadness feels like, what the disappointment feels like, what the confusion feels like. Just holding the space and moving into that, and not expecting someone to come along and save you. Not expecting me to come along and say it's all right, because I won't.
And I think that's so fascinating, because it is part of what I've experienced as well, as folks have said, what, and I know this is crazy to think about, but like, sort of, what do I have to gain by doing this work? Or to, like, they're looking for what's in it for me. And also, like, oh, it is uncomfortable. Right. And so therefore, I can just sort of give it more of a face value, kind of a attention around the fact that, well, I say I'm not racist or I'm colorblind or whatever, but in fact, it really hasn't been a huge, deep interrogation, which is, I know what Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams keeps asking for one, is to interrogate that which you're assuming is, whatever your status quo. And I've heard a lot of people say that, oh, they sound angry. Right. And I know you've heard this. And when I say they, I don't mean just you and she and your co-authors. I just mean folks who bring up this issue and talk about this issue.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that and kind of unpack that for a second as to why that's not really where you're coming from?
Yeah. There is anger in my experience. But that's not where I'm coming from. If I were coming from a place of anger, you would know that. Like, you wouldn't feel safe around me. But we come from a place of love, wanting people to be happy, wanting people to be free from their suffering. However, we have developed really sophisticated strategies to avoid being pointed in the direction of doing this work. So tone policing, that kind of like, oh, I don't like your tone, so I can't listen to you. Or I feel like you're angry, so I can't listen to you. Those are just strategies to avoid doing the work. And as someone whom those strategies have been like used against, I know what they are, and it doesn't bother me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can label me angry all you want, but that's not my experience that I'm having in this moment with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to have a kind of fortitude. Again, it's having an experience of who and what you are, having a basic trust in that. And that's what actually helps me to hold my ground when I'm doing this work.
And a lot of folks say that, the whole point of meditation practice, of looking internally, is to actually see the non-separation, to not only feel the non-separation within ourselves, within our own consciousness, mind, body, spirit, whatever framework you want to use to call it is less relevant than that integrated, sense of wholeness, with that extending into and onto other people, regardless of race and gender and the planet, etc. And so when people are identified with the ego, whatever it is, the personality, the construct, whether it's negative or positive, where does one then begin to chip away and say, here's the benefit. Here's the benefit of what life is like when you see everybody, linked and not ranked.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You have to have an experience of who you are beyond identity in order to have that kind of, I would call it like pure perception or one taste, and we can't perform that, So when people come to me and they're like, I'm colorblind, blah, 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 I don't see color, it's like, if that was actually the case, you wouldn't actually have to say that to anyone. I really feel that, like, you can sense when someone's seeing you, not your race, not your gender, not whatever, like you can see, and I've had those experiences where people pierce into like my very being, and this doesn't matter. They're not responding to that. They're seeing me for who I am, and they're interacting with that piece.
Yeah.
And those have been moments of like immense liberation, like just like intense, like wow, like just a parting of like the ambiguity. And it's been incredible teaching that's really deep in my practice. But we have to work for that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to work for that, and you just can't go around and just say, I get it, we're all the same. You have to do the work to earn that. And there's a lot of this lack of earning experience. Like we parrot experience, we perform experiences, but we're not doing the work to deeply earn these experiences. And that's what meditation is helping us to do. We're earning these experiences, Instead of just calling myself a good person, I want to earn my goodness, through seeing who and what I am, and then developing virtue from that clear seeing of who and what I am, and then bringing that virtue into every interaction that I have with people.
Well, and it does seem that in order to do that, one has to be willing to sort of recognize that at a fundamental level, there's a basic goodness, and that there's the, discipline, quite frankly, required, and the sort of wherewithal to investigate, which isn't always just a day at the beach. At the same time, if one's willing to kind of say, wow, like, look at what else is here, and be curious about it, as opposed to just be overwhelmed by it, I think that that's a real eye-opening position for a lot of folks. Shifting gears a little bit also to talk about sort of the new wave of Me Too and Time's Up, and talking a little bit about how this plays out when it comes to very related material around patriarchy and toxic masculinity and all of these issues that have come up. What's your take on this whole thing right now, and some of the folks that we have in office, and some of the stuff that people are doing to try and become more harmonious?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll start with the last piece, this idea that like we're trying to become harmonious, but we don't understand that like we have to really get super disrupted in order to understand what harmony is. So it's just when I look at Me Too, when I look at Time's Up, it's all oppressions are interconnected. Like everything is like there's a line of power and privilege and dominance that links all of the oppressions that we're talking about. And for our particular country, our society, American culture, we don't actually know how to do the work of reconciling. We don't actually know how to examine our history and to do the work of taking responsibility for the violence that our ancestors, have curated, you know. So that's connected to Time's Up and Me Too, because I think we have to dig a lot deeper than creating like these workplaces and creating relationships and educating us about consent and and boundaries. We have to do the work of interrogating and deconstructing a country that actually survives and perpetuates itself on this kind of violence
Mhm.
against marginalized bodies. It
Mhm.
can be female bodies, it can be anybody, people of color, female bodies, trans bodies, non-binary bodies, um, anybody that's deemed as not being the ideal, white, male, cisgender, so forth. But that's the conversation we have to come into, and until we, in the movement of Me Too and Wake Up, until we are, and Time's Up, until we realize that like we have to link these oppressions with racism and ableism and of course misogyny and patriarchy, we won't see a huge shift in our culture, and we are only looking at the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, really, right now.
Well, one of the things that you brought up was the ancestral history, the sort of backdrop of all of this. And I know that in some of the classes that I've taken, there was a lot of emphasis placed on understanding one's own personal history for white identified people, understanding one's own personal history ancestrally, and where did your folks come from? What did they have to give up to come here? What did it mean to be Americanized and sort of, brought in? Did your name change? What native lands are you living on right now?
Yeah.
Different kinds of ways of kind of looking at the history that one brings to it that is previously uninterrogated and unexamined, and in some cases mired in its own conflict, if you will, in the case of, the genocide of Jews in the Holocaust, for example. Oftentimes that's something that isn't talked about because it's laden with trauma. And so, for example, although, there's a variety of reasons. I know my Italian ancestors came for poverty reasons. They had no way to work there and they came here. And understanding more about what those threads are in terms of connecting back to this fundamental humanity, which is that we're all just trying to survive, trying to connect, trying to, but that can be a portal to connection around these issues.
um exactly. I mean, that can be a doorway into like trying to understand that like we want to be happy and we want to avoid suffering, but we get confused as to how to do that. We actually don't know what real happiness is, and some of us have made a home in suffering.
Hmm.
So when you have all this working together, then you're off on this track where you're just producing violence after violence,
Hmm.
you know and particularly, something that I've been really trying to work really hard on is for male identified folks to start taking responsibility, in this particular movement right now. And within Buddhist communities, male identified practitioners are doing nothing.
They're not doing it.
They're not doing it,
Hmm.
you know.
And why do you think that is? And do you think in Buddhist communities that there's sometimes a sort of a fallback that's so, I don't want to know, I mean, maybe it's spiritual bypassing, I don't know, where it's sort of like, well, that's too messy. Because I remember I was doing a retreat around Christmas and I brought up some issues regarding implicit bias. And it was brought up a couple of times by a couple of white identified practitioners and even the teacher that, like, well, that's not really the place. We're practicing concentration.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, okay, like, can't we do both?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just another way white supremacy and dominance is expressed in Buddhist communities, is where you get to extract these teachings and then dictate, like how they should be practiced and what's appropriate and not appropriate. And that actually keeps us from being able to articulate like these things in our communities that remain silent, you know. And also at the same time, the people who are saying, well, this isn't appropriate to talk about, are sometimes the people who are doing the most dirt, who are doing the most things. That's part of their buy-in to this, is that I don't want to be seen for the things that I've done in the community. So I'm going to create communities and regulate those communities and say, this is not what we're going to talk about. It keeps the lens off of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know? And we haven't, in the Buddhist community, we haven't had this major Me Too movement or Time's Up shift. You know, it's super, super underground, and people come to me and they're like, what's happening? What's happening? Who's organizing? I was like, I don't know.
Like, we are.
Like I haven't heard any. I do my part, you know, with undoing patriarchy work with different sanghas and trying to get other male identified folks to educate themselves, to support other male identified folks in the sangha, but it's really still not enough.
When you're talking to men about their involvement in Me Too and how they can be best, you know, of service, in your case, you're talking to folks in Sangha, in Buddhist communities and stuff, oftentimes it sounds like, but I'm sure other folks too. And I've had plenty of conversations with self-identified straight men who are of various races and whatnot, who are like, oh, we didn't know, or oh, whatever. I'm like, no, you're the one that made the pass at me when you're married. You do know. I'm like, you know, like, you know exactly what we're talking about here. And yet you're like in the ether of entitlement that is like just clouding your sense, your good sense, you know? And so when you're looking at some of these folks and they're not terrible people, right? They're not like bad. We're not talking about like the egregious cases that we've heard come out, but they're your average person who is cloudy. What are the ways that you say to them, like, here's what you can do? Like, what are some of the tips?
Yeah, you know, one of the things I tell people is that, like, you know, look at how you are relating to other people's bodies. You know, what makes you think that you have a right to do certain things? You know, and I give people an experiment. Like, I tell people, you know, and I do this too to an extent sometimes, where it's like, before you do anything, say anything, or look at someone, like, think about what it would be like to ask their permission. You know, can I talk to you? You know, and then to receive that answer, especially if it's no. You know, like, how does that resonate? How does that feel? How does that actually disrupt this belief that you have a right to do something, that you and in particular you have an ownership, you know?
Well, you're speaking about agency and having it be mutual, and sort of, you know, the language that I've used around that issue that you describe is sort of seeing the other person and allowing them to have a full human experience of their humanity, and then you being aware of yourself having a full experience of your own humanity, and that you're engaging on that plane, which is the same plane, as opposed to grab and go. Right. Or stay or not or whatever. But so that idea of asking the question seems to be the root of what there's a lot of backlash about, which is that there are men at the at the water cooler having conversations saying, I wish they would stop hiring women. I don't want to have to be around women. I don't want to even, because I'm afraid that I'm going to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, and I'm going to get, you know, written up or sued or something like that. And so they just want to like cut it off at the pass and just, you know, not have to deal with this. And then there's other women who say, oh, you're ruining romance and you're ruining flirtation and you're ruining whatever. So what do you say to both sides of that?
Well, you know, before I get to that too, I also want to acknowledge that, like, many of us have a really compromised self-agency. So even if we're offered this experience of consent, we sometimes don't know how to relate to it, you know, because we've never had support in that. We've never had support in helping us to understand what my boundaries are, you know, and how to uphold those and to be okay with asserting boundaries. So it's happening on both ends, you know. then to get to this question, how consent maybe is disrupting, I think that there's consent, there are really, at least in my experiences, like for me, consent has been really profound. Like it's like when you get this permission to be in relationship in certain ways, then it's like we're both experiencing power. Whoever I'm with, we're both practicing this agency together, and that can be extremely erotic, you know. But a lot of us are so confused about what we want and what we need, and so consent actually, or the practice of consent actually forces us to get clear about what we want, but we don't know what that is often. So it just adds this kind of confusion to our lives, where in fact, how do we do the work to understand what we really want and what we really need, and to start relating to others around us as people who also want and need things? And how do we enter into relationships where we're compromising and supporting one another? And I think that's where consent can be really beautiful. It's like, if you do this correctly, then you're getting what you want and need. Instead of just like entering into this like one-sided relationship where you're just getting things, another person just isn't having a positive experience. So this is liberating for us. It liberates us even more, but it forces us to look at all of our stuff and to take responsibility for it. And that's what men are talking about when they're standing around the water cooler. They're like, oh, if we can just not have women, what they're actually saying is like, I don't know how to deal with this conditioning of being a male in this society. I don't know what I want. I don't know what I need, so it's better just to avoid it, and that's exactly, quite honestly, that's exactly how the early Buddhist Sangha emerged. That's exactly how the Buddha established the early Sangha. It was like, okay, I'm going to take all these men and ordain them, and we're going to like not have women because women are the problem. So that's exactly how the early Sangha thought. It was like, oh, we'll be a lot better if women weren't a part of this.
Let's not allow women a seat at the table, because then I won't be tempted, as opposed to what's the root of my temptation, and can I have agency over my own impulses and desires, and enact someone else into the process of engagement as to possibly being rejected, which might be okay if you had a good self-image.
Exactly. And so I often feel, and I really believe this, is that like, I understand undoing patriarchy for myself in a similar way that I understand undoing whiteness for white people. It's like, for me, being a cisgendered male, for me, it's been having to come into a grieving and a sadness, looking at the ways in which I've been conditioned to dominate, and also looking at the ways in which I enjoy this privilege of me being male-bodied and cisgender. How I can move through the world in certain ways. And so I've been really paying attention to that. And just, you have to acknowledge it. You have to be like, yeah, I enjoy this.
So like, right, because and that's what I've heard from a lot of folks who are white identified, who are just like, sort of begrudgingly acknowledging that, like, but I enjoy my privilege. I don't really want to give it up, even though I know it's the right thing to do. And the right thing to do, meaning that it's more connected in the alleviation of all, that it feels better at the end of the day, but it's a little uncomfortable getting there.
But you can't give it up. Like, you have centuries and centuries and centuries of privilege that's been built up. And so you can give up something, but you're still going to benefit. The same thing with male privilege and patriarchy. It's like, I can disrupt this all I want, but it's still there. So this work is lifetimes of work. This is generations of work that we're having to do.
Yeah. So speaking of that, with that word generations, I was going to ask you again about generational stuff. Like, do you sense a shift between, people that you talk to who are 60 and 70 versus people who you talk to who are 30 and 40 versus people in their teens or 20s or whatever? And if so, what is that about just these issues in general, and what do we have to learn from one another?
Yeah. And I think that like with our generation, it's very much, you know, kind of like being super hip to this shift. Like we're stepping into the shift. You know, I think we've had to learn a lot to do the stepping into the shift. For the older generations, I think it's just like it's something that's really confusing. You know, it's like it's really hard to talk about gender with older folks. You know, like so you're either a boy or a girl, you know, and you're like, okay, no, there's a lot happening, you know. But with younger generations, this is a second language for them. You know, when I talk to younger people, it's just like, especially younger people who are really doing this work, it's just like they're thinking about things in ways that like I'm having to learn how to do, you know? Um, so I feel really great about that. The younger generations coming up, you know, this is the information generation, you know, so like they've had this information at their disposal, you know, because of the internet, because of technology. Um, and so I feel good about those kinds of shifts, you know, happening. But what I'm actually more concerned with is the shift around um, personal relationships. How do we develop relationships and how technology disrupts that? You know, and also this idea around consumption and happiness. You know, that's why I'm hoping a shift can come, you know, in some generation.
Mm-hmm.
I think older generations do it a little better. This idea of like, okay, how do you live with less? You know, I think younger generations are like, it's easy for us to accumulate things because I think that we're trying to avoid connecting to how unstable the world is. You know, that we're born into the situation and we don't know what's going to happen day to day, particularly with this administration, with this government, with climate change and everything. We just don't know. So there's a lot of anxiety and tension that we're using consumption to avoid dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that hungry ghost phenomenon of just always needing to feed the beast, so to speak, but having the hole be so small, it's not actually satisfying anything, and it's just sort of this gallop into what we would call sense pleasures. That if you string enough of them together, you can try to hold something together for a while, but at some point the bottom drops out, um, and and then you have to have your day of reckoning.
Yeah, yeah. You just string one distraction together after the other. You know, that's the use. That's why we have smartphones because they're always there to distract us.
So instead of consuming stuff, and instead of staying on our smartphone all the time, one of the remedies might be connection with other people in real time, right? In real life.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the importance of, as you mentioned earlier, Sangha, community, Kaya and Mita, good spiritual friends, just people who you trust and know love you and have your back?
Yeah, I tell people to go where they're loved. You know, and you go where you're loved, you're more likely to trust the places, the environment, the group, and you're much more likely to practice this kind of vulnerability, you know, and that's really important. And in terms of like personal relationships, you know, we can't practice vulnerability with everyone, but it's so important that we have a couple of people that we can be completely open with, you know, that we can do the work of relating to another person in front of us, not a screen, not like an interface, but just a person in front of us. And then we can hold the space for what that triggers for us. What it means to sit in front of another human being and to see parts of ourselves reflected in ways that we can't see reflected in our technologies. You know, we're losing that ability. You know, so it's so important that we spend time with people, we spend time in community, and to spend time in community without technology. You know, to spend time with just people sitting together and experiencing one another. You know, but you have to do it in an environment where you feel loved and seen. You know, and it's, you know, for me, it's like I don't have a lot of communities that I feel a part of, but the ones that I do, I really cherish and take seriously.
And I think that, they've said, if you have 5 really good friends, then that beats having 50, sort of acquaintances or whatever. And along those lines, do you have any recommendations? Because some of this is Buddhist practice and insight and looking inward. Some of it is just sort of basic safety, like they would call it secure attachment, or basic safety in your nervous system, regulating your nervous system, being comfortable in your body. But some of it's also just knowing how to communicate, like Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication stuff, to say like, when you this, I feel this, I need this, could you do this? Like those basic strategies. So I just don't think that we're teaching folks how to do a lot of the very basic skills that we need to feed us the nourishment that we're not going to get in the consumer world, that we could get from co-regulating with other people. Because frankly, I'm not convinced we can do it alone under the Bodhi tree, all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't know how to communicate with one another. We actually, because communication, really transformative communication, comes out of a place of vulnerability. So we have to have a sense of what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, what we need and what we want, and we have to know how to communicate that. We're not doing that. We're kind of hiding out from ourselves, and when we do that, we're just talking past one another. And a lot of us, we don't feel safe in communicating what we need or want or what we care about, because we've had experiences where those things have been used to hurt us.
Well, that goes back to what you said earlier when you inserted this really necessary piece about agency and boundaries, where you were basically saying a lot of people who would be, for lack of a better word, encroached upon in a assertive, aggressive way, where they weren't asked, if they were asked even, that they might cave, for lack of a better word, perhaps, because they haven't had the experience of developing stronger boundaries that kind of can be the container that can help support, the integrity of what it is that, a full experience of being an agent in one's own life, might look like. So along those lines, with vulnerability, you only want to pick a few people, like you say, that you're going to be good with. You want to be able to communicate clearly, but you also want to maintain those healthy boundaries, which is sort of the discernment aspect of wisdom, rather. So when you're talking to people, how do you in real time sort of suggest to them, like, here's how you do it? Here's some suggestions for you. Because I think that there's a lot of people out there that say, this is really good on paper and it sounds nice, but I wouldn't, in the most remote part of me, know where to begin.
Yeah. I mean, the first step is knowing what you want and what you need. Like just having a sense of that. Like you may be in a situation, you may be in an interaction. How do you just check in on the spot with yourself and say, is this something that is okay for me? Is this something that I feel comfortable doing? What am I sensing hesitation? Like where am I intuiting into the situation that I need to pay attention to? I mean, that's really where we start. We ask ourselves, like, what do I need? What do I want? And for me, I do exercises with people, with groups, where I have people reflect on, okay, what do you want? And from that list of what you want, what is it that you absolutely need? And then you start building a kind of agency with that. Like, if you don't need to be around certain people, then you should start creating ways of not being around them. But on the spot, in the moment, always checking in and saying, am I okay now? What do I need to do? What do I want? And what do I need right now? And then making those choices to offer yourself what you need.
And I think the last question I'll ask about this is, you said sensing and intuiting, and a
Yeah.
lot of that is the more somatic aspects. We
Yeah.
would call it a body scan, or we would call it a getting a sense of not just what's up here, but what's
Mm-hmm.
from here down, which is a lot
Mm-hmm.
of what meditation can do. It's one of the techniques is to be mindful of the body. And I know we did a meditation together once that you had led about that. And I guess I just wanted to maybe give people a little window. Maybe you could just do a quick suggestion as to how they can start to trust that
Yeah.
intuitive sense about
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Yeah, a practice that I would suggest is actually bringing attention down to our core, our gut area, because in the stomach area, the vagus nerve like reaches down into the gut, and so the gut, because of that nerve, is considered like the second brain, you know. And so there's a lot of data being generated in our core, in our guts, in our stomachs. And so I am always bringing attention to that. If I'm out, walking around, if I'm on the subway, if I'm in in an interaction, like just check in and say, okay, how am I, feeling in my gut? Like, is it weird? Is it good? Am I relaxed? Is it tight? And that actually helps me to determine, what this interaction is all about. If it's something I need to move away from, I know that because I feel tight.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something that's really helping me or if something is really healthy, I just feel really relaxed and open. I feel that all in my gut. And you can feel that in different parts of your body, but the gut is often where we feel it the strongest.
But for people who are traumatized, don't they sometimes have like a sensation of a 12 when it's really like a situation in the present moment that's a 2, and then they
Exactly.
get confused about
Yeah.
what's real?
Yeah. Yeah. And so that comes, to work with that, we're actually having to practice a kind of spaciousness around that those sensations coming up. That's body sensation. That's also mental experiences. So you allow that to be there, and you relax, and then you begin to understand how your internal kind of like meter works. Because it's off. It's in a different maybe position. And so you understand that position, and then you're able to relax around that and to discern, how to work with situations that are triggering.
And I think that is the work of meditation, really, is to get back more into that homeostasis
Yeah.
place where, somatically our nervous system is more balanced, and then we're more in that equanimous, state mentally and emotionally, so we can respond with clarity and not just go off the rails or double down on erroneous beliefs that can cause further harm to ourselves or others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lama Rod, anything else you want to say before we wrap?
Yeah, last thing I'll say is that it's so important to understand what our work is, and that we all have different work to do. We also have different front lines to be on. So we have to figure out what that is and just go to it and do it.
So basically, don't feel bad if what you're doing isn't what someone else is doing,
Exactly.
but don't feel like that gives you license to just sit back on your laurels and do nothing.
Yes, exactly. Mhm.
Okay, I feel you. Lama Rod Owens, thank you so much. The website is lamarod.com. You're all over the place doing all kinds of teachings, and I know you're in New York and along the East Coast, but also all around the country and probably the world as well.
Yeah. I'll be in Europe this spring for 6 weeks in the
Woo!
UK, in Europe, teaching the book, teaching my own work as well. So all of that will be up on my website, hopefully in the next week.
Lama Rod Owens, it's really an honor and a pleasure. The book is Radical Dharma. He's amazing, and I'm so glad you had a chance to spend some time with us today for WiseGirl, where we invite the wise girl and the wise guy within you, the listener and the viewer, to be discovered. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.